The weight of the world pressing on someone who has spent decades dissecting every rumor, every claim, every fragment of truth. Imagine a voice that millions trusted suddenly confronted with a story so explosive, so deeply unsettling, that even he, the relentless interrogator of ideas, the fearless chronicler of modern culture, found himself hesitating, trembling at the very edges of comprehension. The news had landed like a hurricane in the middle of a quiet night, a revelation that intertwined power, secrecy, and tragedy in ways no one wanted to believe. Joe Rogan, the man who had interviewed presidents, scientists, and Hollywood icons alike, suddenly became the witness to a narrative he could not ignore, a story that would haunt him for weeks, nights stretching into mornings, the kind of story that erodes sleep. Leaving a hollow ache in the chest, IT began with a call from someone he thought he could trust, a voice shadowed by fear, urgency, and sorrow. They spoke in hushed tones about events unfolding behind closed doors, about lives quietly destroyed by decisions made in rooms no one could enter. The details were so sharp, so vivid, that Joe felt a visceral tremor, an almost physical reaction, something between horror and disbelief. And yet, he knew he couldn't turn away. Millions of people were watching. But for the first time, he felt the story watching him, as if the consequences would reach beyond his studio, beyond his listeners, beyond the carefully curated boundaries of his public life. He called his closest friends, people who had seen him at his most raw, Hollywood actors who had shared quiet confessions in his greenlit studio, scientists who had whispered truths in front of microphones they never thought would air, and fellow podcasters who had endured their own brushes with public outrage. Each conversation left him with more pieces of a puzzle that few said to fit together if he remembered the night vividly, one that would replay endlessly in his mind. The sky outside his Los Angeles home had been overcast, the kind of gray that seeps into your bones. He sat alone in the studio, the microphone illuminated by a single warm light, and scrolled through documents that made his hand shake. There were names, dates, and cryptic phrases that hinted at connections stretching into realms of influence he had long suspected but never dared confront. He paused when a familiar name appeared, someone whose life had already been splashed across tabloids and talk shows. He felt a pang of regret, a deep, gnawing awareness that this revelation might redefine the narratives of people he had admired, people he had trusted, people whose laughter and tears he had once shared in quiet conversations behind the microphone. The pain wasn't just intellectual, it was deeply personal. He thought of his own family, the way his young children looked at him with blind faith, the way his partner relied on him not just as a provider, but as a guardian of truth. How could he navigate the storm he was about to unleash without shattering the fragile sense of safety in his own home? The ethical weight pressed down like a vice. And then, the images began. Not literal photographs, but mental snapshots of lives quietly eroding, of careers abruptly ended, of hidden illnesses exposed, of last words spoken in fear and silence. Every piece of information carried the subtle tremor of human cost. The realization struck him hard. This was not just a story. It was a mosaic of tragedy, regret, and secrets so potent that revealing them could ignite forces beyond his control. He spent hours pacing, rehearsing conversations, imagining every possible outcome, revisiting every interview he had ever conducted, every guest he had allowed to speak freely. Shadows of past con. Science, Elon Musk laughing nervously, Robert Downey Jr. Reflecting on mistakes, Dr. Rhonda Patrick speaking of health crises, flickered across his memory, each a reminder that truth carries consequences heavier than fame or fortune. The moral weight became unbearable. He felt a physical tightness in his chest, a tightening that reminded him of the frailty of human life, of the invisible scars that even the strongest among us carry. And in that quiet, heavy moment, he realized that once this story aired, nothing would ever be the same. There was a tremor in his voice the next day, one that none of his millions of listeners could hear over the polished soundboard, a trembling that betrayed the magnitude of what he had uncovered. He rehearsed and re-rehearsed his words, aware that every syllable could ignite shockwaves across media, politics, and Hollywood itself. Yet beneath it all, a quiet, almost imperceptible sorrow lingered, a grief for those whose lives had been irrevocably altered, a recognition that some truths are too heavy for one person to bear alone. Joe Rogan, the fearless, unflinching seeker of reality, had become a man weighed down by the intimate knowledge of pain, scandal, and hidden tragedies that the world might never fully comprehend. The studio lights dimmed, the city outside oblivious to the moral tempest raging inside him. He sat back in the chair, gripping the microphone as if it were both a lifeline and a confession booth. Somewhere in the shadows of history, in whispers between Hollywood legends, scientists, and public figures, the threads of this story had always existed. But now, for the first time, they had converged in his hands, in his voice, in his conscience. And as the clock ticked toward the moment of broadcast, he realized the truth he had uncovered was more than controversial. It was human, it was devastating, and it was unavoidable. The next morning, the weight had not lifted. If anything, it had intensified. Joe Rogan stared at the blinking cursor on his laptop, the blank page a mirror to the chaos swirling in his mind. Every headline, every breaking story he had ever dissected suddenly felt like a rehearsal for this moment. This wasn't just commentary anymore. It was confrontation with a reality too tangled, too devastating to reduce to sound bites or jokes. He thought of the people whose lives hung in the balance, the families silently suffering, the careers teetering on ruin, the whispers of illness and despair that had never reached the public eye. The guilt was unbearable. The silence was unbearable. The only thing he could hear was the faint hum of his equipment, a heartbeat that seemed almost mocking in its steadiness. He called a few trusted insiders, people he knew would speak candidly, and what he heard only deepened the dread. There were admissions of negligence, quiet apologies that had never been aired, confessions wrapped in fear and trembling. One voice, a figure he had known in Hollywood circles for decades, spoke almost in fragments, each word a dagger. They don't know, the voice whispered. They have no idea what's been happening, and some of them will never forgive themselves if it comes out. Joe's chest tightened, the room closing in as he realized the truth wasn't just scandalous. It was corrosive. It was poisonous. It had been simmering for years, buried under layers of secrecy and reputation. And now it had found him. As he prepared for the day's recording, the tension became physical. His hands shook as he adjusted the microphone, his throat dry, his heart a relentless drumbeat against the cage of his ribs. Even the people he usually trusted to keep him grounded, the producers, the engineers, the co-hosts, sensed the tremor in his energy. There was a fragility in his gaze, a vulnerability rarely seen by his audience, a crack in the armor of the man who had made a career out of fearless confrontation. He thought of his own parents, their quiet resilience, their struggles, and he realized that the cycle of human pain, hidden, unspoken, tragic, was repeating itself before his eyes, stretching from the privileged towers of Hollywood to the quiet corners of ordinary life. The phone rang again, a call from someone whose involvement was more personal than professional. Their voice was raw, almost breaking. "Joe, you have to understand, we never meant for it to reach this point," they said, each syllable weighted with regret. Joe closed his eyes and let the words wash over him, feeling the enormity of the hidden truths that had been kept in shadows for too long. Names were mentioned, details hinted at, each revelation a shard of glass cutting through the veil of normalcy he had known. He thought of other figures who had walked similar paths, the pain that had silently followed celebrities like Robin Williams, the hidden struggles of icons like Whitney Houston and Heath Ledger. The parallels were haunting. The same human fragility, the same darkness lurking behind public smiles. By mid-afternoon, he was exhausted, yet sleep was impossible. He walked the quiet streets near his home, each step echoing against the empty avenues, feeling as though the city itself held its breath. Every conversation he had, every piece of evidence he had seen, gnawed at him. He remembered the quiet sobs of a guest he had interviewed years ago, the unspoken grief in their eyes, and realized how much of the world's suffering exists behind closed doors, unseen and unacknowledged. And now, he had been thrust into the role of witness, of messenger, of reluctant confessor. The responsibility was crushing. That evening, as he returned to tea, he sat in the dim glow of the monitors and allowed himself a moment of vulnerability, something rare for a man who had made his life broadcasting confidence and curiosity. He thought of his own children again, their innocent trust, and felt an ache that was almost unbearable. What would they think of the truths he was about to reveal? How would they navigate a world so saturated with hidden tragedy, with secrets too heavy to carry alone? His hands trembled as he lifted the microphone. The familiar studio suddenly transformed into a chamber of confessions, a stage for heartbreak and revelation. Joe Rogan, for the first time in years, felt powerless. He had faced combative politicians, controversial scientists, and provocative celebrities, yet nothing had prepared him for the intimacy of this moment, the suffocating proximity to human despair, the moral weight of truth entangled with secrecy, regret, and unspoken tragedy. And as the first notes of his recording session played, he realized the world was about to witness more than a podcast. They were about to witness a reckoning, a confrontation with the darkness that lives not in headlines, but in hearts and minds, in rooms locked away from public eyes, where the consequences of power, illness, and grief silently fester. The next hours were a blur of preparation, but not the kind that comes with routine. This was preparation weighed down by dread, by the gnawing realization that once these words left his lips, there would be no turning back. Joe Rogan stared at the notes he had painstakingly compiled, each page filled with fragments of conversations, cryptic emails, and transcribed recordings, but the more he read, the more fragmented it all seemed. Faces of the people involved flickered in his mind. Friends he had trusted, guests who had confided in him, public figures whose smiles had hidden deeper storms. And beneath each memory, an undercurrent of sorrow, a quiet awareness of mistakes made, of lives disrupted, of secrets that had festered far too long. He remembered one phone call in particular, a voice breaking with desperation, recounting details of scandal that had remained hidden for decades. The trembling words painted images he could not erase. A young woman, tears streaking her face, forced to conceal illness and trauma to protect the reputations of those in power. A Hollywood actor, adored by millions, hiding regret so heavy it seemed to crush his very spirit. A scientist whose career was quietly destroyed, whose discoveries had been buried under bureaucracy and fear. Every story carried the same thread: human fragility, betrayal, suffering, and the tragic consequences of silence. Joe felt as if he were carrying the weight of all these lives in the hollow of his chest, each beat a reminder of the responsibility he now bore. As he prepared to go live, he replayed past interviews, moments he had thought inconsequential. Elon Musk joking about improbable futures, Dr. Rhonda Patrick speaking softly about health crises, celebrities sharing intimate struggles. All now seemed connected to the hidden truths he had uncovered. And with every recollection, a pang of guilt sharpened in his chest. Could he have recognized the signs sooner? Could he have intervened, or at least softened the blow? The answer was impossible to grasp, leaving him suspended in a limbo between remorse and necessity. The studio lights glowed dimly. The microphones hum a constant reminder of the imminent broadcast. Joe's voice, usually commanding and playful, now carried a tremor, subtle but undeniable. He spoke with a careful cadence, aware that each pause, each inflection, could shape how the world received the story. "What I'm about to share," he began, his tone both solemn and almost fragile, "is not a story of fame or fortune. It's a story of human suffering, secrecy, and regret. It's a story that has touched the lives of people you think. In ways you could never imagine." Even as he said it, he felt the heaviness settle into his shoulders, a tangible weight pressing down as though the room itself demanded he honor the gravity of what he was about to reveal. He spoke of last words whispered in hospital rooms, of family pain carefully concealed from public view, of illnesses hidden behind smiling faces on red carpets. He recounted moments of betrayal and regret, carefully preserving the dignity of those involved while still exposing the truths that had long been silenced. At one point, his own voice cracked, barely audible, swallowed by the acoustics of the studio, but it was enough to betray the depth of the empathy, the personal sorrow he carried. Behind every revelation was a human cost, a life upended, a promise broken, a legacy forever altered. By the end of the session, Joe felt hollow yet electrified. He had laid bare the shadows of power, the hidden tragedies, the regrets too long buried. But the aftermath was immediate and unrelenting. Messages flooded in, frantic, angry, grief-stricken. Some accused him of sensationalism. Others thanked him for exposing truths that had long been suppressed. Yet amidst the cacophony, the private burden remained. He knew that the real suffering, the family's enduring pain, the careers quietly shattered, the lives irreversibly touched, would continue long after the headlines faded. And in the quiet hours, staring at the darkened monitors, he felt the chilling realization that the story was far from over. Even as he left the studio, the streets outside seemed different, heavier, as if the city itself had absorbed some of the sorrow he had carried. Shadows seemed longer, silences more profound. And somewhere in that darkness, he understood a truth he had never fully confronted before. Knowledge, no matter how necessary, is never without cost. He had opened a door to human tragedy, and the echoes of what he had uncovered would follow him, unrelenting, through the nights, through the conversations, through every private moment when the weight of truth became inescapable. Night had fallen by the time Joe returned to his home, the city lights flickering like distant stars, indifferent to the storm raging inside him. He moved through the quiet halls, each step heavy, each shadow a reminder of the lives tangled in the story he had just told. He thought of his children, sleeping peacefully upstairs, blissfully unaware of the darkness that had brushed so close to his own life today. The contrast was unbearable. Innocence cocooned in safety, while outside, the world he had unveiled teetered on the edge of chaos and heartbreak. He felt a choking mixture of sorrow and guilt, a deep ache that spread from his chest into his very bones that a call came just past midnight, one he hadn't expected. It was a figure from Hollywood, someone whose career had been intimately entwined with the scandal he had exposed. Their voice trembled over the line, fragile and raw. "Joe, I didn't want this to reach the light," they whispered, each word carrying the weight of confessions that had been locked away for decades. "We thought if we just kept quiet, it would disappear. But it didn't. And now everything is broken." The trembling in their voice mirrored the turmoil in his own heart. He knew, without needing to ask, that families would grieve, friendships would fracture, and some reputations wow. Returning home, Joe sat alone in the dim light of his studio, staring at the microphone as if it were a confessional altar. He thought of the families caught in the crossfire, the private suffering made public, and the ripple effect that would inevitably follow. He thought of his own parents, his own children, and wondered how the knowledge he now carried might affect them in ways he could not foresee. He felt a quiet tremor in his chest, a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. This was not about ratings, not about controversy, not about curiosity. It was about human lives, fragile and fragile again, colliding with secrets that had festered far too long. Hours passed like slow-moving shadows, and Joe's exhaustion became a dull, constant ache. Yet sleep would not come. Every noise, every creak of his home, reminded him of the voices he had heard that day, the tremors of regret, the whispered confessions, the quiet heartbreak of those whose lives had been upended. He realized that truth, once revealed, does not vanish. It lingers. It echoes. It changes everything, both for those exposed and for those forced to witness it. And in the stillness of that night, he understood that the story he had unveiled was not over. It would haunt him, as it would haunt the world for a long time to come. That'd be why the early hours of dawn. He was left with a singular, inescapable thought. Some truths are so heavy that they reshape the people who bear them. And he, Joe Rogan, had just become one of the heaviest carriers of all. The quiet weight of human suffering, regret, and hidden tragedy settled in his soul like a shadow he could never shake, a burden that would follow him into every conversation, every interview, every private moment of reflection for the rest of his life.